stood on my graduation stage while thousands cheered. And 3 seats stayed empty. My parents skipped my graduation to calm my sister's tantrum. No apology. No explanation. Just a text saying they couldn't make it. That moment shattered something I'd spent my whole life protecting. Because when love is conditional, one wrong choice can erase you. What I did next exposed years of lies and triggered consequences they never saw coming. If you're interested in this gist, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments, and I will give you a heart. My name is Quinn Carter, and for most of my life I was known as the easy one, the strong one, the daughter who didn't need much, a label spoken like praise but lived like limitation, because being easy meant I wasn't supposed to ask questions, being strong meant I wasn't allowed to struggle, and not needing much meant my needs were always the first to be dismissed. I grew up in a quiet suburb outside Detroit where lawns were trimmed on schedule, and nothing ever looked out of place from the street. Our house fit the picture perfectly with neutral paint, family photos aligned neatly by the entryway, and a dining table polished every Sunday like order itself was a virtue. From the outside we looked like a family that had everything figured out, but inside everything revolved around my older sister Vanessa, my parents' pride and constant concern. From as early as I can remember, she was described with the same words over and over again. Fragile, emotional, sensitive, someone who needed extra care. And my parents repeated it so often it stopped sounding like opinion and started sounding like law. If Vanessa was upset, plans changed. If she wanted something, everyone adjusted. If she struggled, the rest of us slowed down to accommodate her. And I learned early that peace in our house depended on one thing: giving way. So I did. I learned how to smile and step back, how to read the room before speaking, how to decide in seconds whether what I wanted was worth the disruption it might cause, and most of the time it wasn't. Being easy meant being quiet. Being strong meant asking for less. I didn't disappear completely. I just learned how to take up less space. Birthdays told the story better than anything else because Vanessa's birthdays were loud and elaborate, with balloons brushing the ceiling, restaurant tables pushed together for relatives, laughter spilling into the parking lot like joy needed an audience. While mine were smaller, a store-bought cake, a rushed hug, my mom smiling while glancing at her phone, already half somewhere else, saying we'll do something bigger next year. A year that never came. At dinner I'd reach for the last piece of chicken and hear my dad clear his throat, telling me to leave it for my sister because I didn't need much and I was strong. And I believed him. I believed strength meant restraint and that wanting less made you better, not neglected. That belief settling into my bones over time. School became my refuge, not because I loved attention but because achievement felt like proof that I existed. Effort was something I could control. And when I brought home awards, my parents nodded like it was expected. My mom saying "That's great, Quinn," while already turning to ask Vanessa how her day went. And when Vanessa had a bad one, everything else stopped. Homework could wait, celebrations could be postponed, my accomplishments learning to arrive quietly, sit politely, and leave without making a mess. Still I held on to one quiet hope: graduation, telling myself that 4 years of late nights, part-time work, endless stress, and quiet perseverance had to count for something. Imagining my parents in the crowd, my mom crying, my dad clapping too loudly. Imagining being chosen just once without comparison or condition. A hope that felt reasonable and earned, ignoring the warning signs I'd learned to live with. Because graduation wasn't the beginning of the betrayal, but the moment I stopped pretending the pattern didn't exist. The night before the ceremony, my phone lit up with my mom's name, and her voice took that low rush tone it always did when Vanessa was involved, telling me my sister wasn't doing well, that she was overwhelmed and emotional, that they might need to stay back, not that they'd try, not that they'd be there no matter what, just that they might stay back, like my graduation was a flexible appointment that could be moved around my sister's mood. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at my folded gown and said it was just one day, that it only happened once. And after a pause, my mom sighed and told me I was strong and I'd understand. A sentence that landed heavier than any argument ever could, because you're strong wasn't comfort, it was a verdict that meant don't ask, don't push, don't need us right now. I told myself they'd still come, that they'd figure it out in the morning. Because Vanessa always had storms like this, and somehow the world always kept spinning. The morning of graduation arriving in unnatural quiet with no calls or updates. Me dressing alone and adjusting my cap in the mirror, trying to ignore the tightness in my chest, texting to ask where they were and getting a reply that came quickly and without emotion saying they couldn't make it because my sister needed them. No apology, no pride, no acknowledgement of what the day meant. Standing in the stadium later, watching other families wave and shout names while the sun burned my shoulders and cold Clarity settled into my bones, realizing this wasn't about an emergency but hierarchy and knowing exactly where I stood in it. Something inside me shifting as I walked back to my seat after my name was called. Not loudly or dramatically but quietly like a door closing. Folding my gown in silence that night, replaying the message again and again. Your sister needs us. And for the first time asking myself, what if this never changes? Not crying, not calling anyone. Opening my closet and pulling out an old suitcase, understanding something terrifying and final, that if I stayed I would keep disappearing. Favoritism in my family was never announced out loud. No one ever sat me down and said your sister matters more than you. It didn't need to be said because it was enforced quietly and consistently through 1,000 small decisions that always landed the same way. Growing up I learned that everything in our house operated on an invisible scale, and Vanessa's needs always outweighed mine. If she was tired, dinner ran late. If she was upset, plans were cancelled. If she was anxious, the rest of us tiptoed around her mood like it was fragile glass. My parents spoke about her emotions with reverence like they were sacred and dangerous all at once. Vanessa's feelings were storms that required immediate shelter, while mine were light rain, inconvenient but manageable. And I absorbed that lesson early without realizing it was shaping the way I saw myself. When I came home from school excited about something, a good grade, a compliment from a teacher, an invitation to join a club, I learned to check the temperature of the room before speaking. If Vanessa was sulking on the couch or snapping at my mom, I kept quiet. My news could wait, my joy could wait, and it always did. Over time that waiting became instinct. I didn't feel wronged, I felt responsible for maintaining balance. That responsibility settled onto my shoulders without anyone asking if I wanted it. At family gatherings, relatives praised Vanessa's sensitivity and creativity while describing me as mature for my age, so independent, so low maintenance. The adults smiled when they said it like it was a compliment, but what they didn't see was how those words boxed me in. Being low maintenance meant I wasn't supposed to need anything. Being mature meant I wasn't supposed to complain. And if I did, it felt like a betrayal of the role everyone had already assigned me. Even when Vanessa lashed out, slammed doors, or accused everyone of not understanding her, my parents framed it as stress, pressure, too much on her plate. When I stayed quiet and swallowed my frustration, it was framed as strength. Look at Quinn, my dad would say, she handles things so well. And I didn't realize then that handling things well often just means handling them alone. As we got older, the pattern only deepened. When Vanessa struggled in school, tutors were hired, deadlines negotiated, teachers called. When I struggled, I adjusted, I stayed up later, I worked harder. I told myself this was fairness because she needed help and I didn't. That story was easier to believe than the alternative. By the time I reached my teenage years, favoritism had hardened into routine. Vanessa's crises became the organizing principle of our family life. Vacations were rescheduled, dinners were tense, weekends unpredictable. My parents were perpetually on alert, waiting for the next emotional drop. And I became skilled at shrinking my presence, smoothing conversations, redirecting attention away from myself before it caused friction. I thought I was being considerate. I didn't realize I was disappearing. There were moments when the imbalance was impossible to ignore, like the time I made varsity on my school's academic team after weeks of preparation, and the competition fell on the same weekend. Vanessa decided she didn't want to attend a family friend's wedding. My parents chose to stay home with her and I went alone. Another time I was accepted into a summer program I had dreamed about for years, and the acceptance letter sat on the kitchen counter while my mom spent hours on the phone calming Vanessa down over a fight with a friend. When I finally mentioned the program, my mom smiled distractedly and said, "That's wonderful, honey, we'll talk about it later," and later never came. I learned that later was just another word for never when it came to me. Despite everything, I didn't hate my sister, and that was what made it so complicated. Vanessa didn't wake up one day and decide to be the center of gravity. She had been raised to expect it. Every time she struggled, the world rearranged itself to make room for her. That kind of reinforcement doesn't create self-awareness, it creates entitlement wrapped in vulnerability. I saw it even then, but I didn't feel allowed to name it. Whenever I tried to point out the imbalance, my parents shut it down quickly, saying I was comparing, that it wasn't healthy, or asking why I couldn't just be happy for my sister. The message was clear: acknowledging the problem made me the problem, so I stopped acknowledging it. I told myself families weren't supposed to be fair, that love came in different forms, that my parents showed love by trusting me to handle things on my own. It was a convincing story because it made endurance feel noble, but endurance without care slowly becomes erosion. I felt it in subtle ways, in how I hesitated before asking for help, in how I downplayed my own stress, and how I apologized for needing things that were reasonable. When friends commented on how independent I was, I smiled because independence sounded better than neglected. By the time college applications rolled around, the dynamic was so ingrained it felt natural. Vanessa's decisions were discussed at length, her anxieties managed collectively. My plans were announced after the fact. I chose a school close enough to be practical, far enough to breathe. My parents congratulated me, proud but unsurprised. "Of course you'll do fine, my dad said, you always do." And it wasn't meant to hurt, but it did, because fine meant invisible. And invisible meant not worth rearranging anything for. Still, I carried hope with me, quiet hope, but hope nonetheless. I believed there would be a moment when my consistency would be seen, when my steadiness would be rewarded. Graduation became that symbol in my mind, proof that all the patience, all the waiting, all the silence had meaning. I didn't realize then how dangerous that hope was, because when love is conditional, the condition is never finally met, it just keeps moving. And by the time I stood on that stage years later, the rules of our family were already set in stone. Favoritism wasn't a flaw, it was policy. And I had been complying with it my entire life without ever signing my name. By the time my final year of college arrived, graduation had taken on a meaning far bigger than a ceremony. It wasn't just about finishing school or walking across a stage, it had become a quiet promise I made to myself, a belief that if I endured long enough, if I kept doing everything right, there would be a moment when my parents would finally look at me and choose me without hesitation. I didn't say this out loud to anyone, because saying it would have made it fragile. I carried it privately, the way you carry something you're afraid might disappear if exposed. Every late night in the library, every shift at my part-time job, every exam I took while exhausted fed into that belief: this will be the moment, this is where it changes. I imagined it in small, vivid ways: my mom leaning forward in her seat, eyes scanning the program for my name, my dad standing up a little too fast when it was called, clapping louder than everyone else. I imagined their pride not as relief that I wasn't a problem, but as recognition that I mattered on my own. It felt reasonable to want that. Graduation only happens once, it marks years of work, discipline, and growth. Surely that was enough to earn undivided attention for one day. I didn't frame it as competition with Vanessa, I framed it as a milestone that existed outside of her orbit. I thought that was possible. Leading up to it, I communicated clearly. I sent them the date early, I reminded them casually, I shared details about seating and timing. They nodded and said of course wouldn't miss it. Those words settled into me like reassurance, and I built my expectations on them. As the day approached, stress mounted the way it always does at the end of a long chapter. Finals, paperwork, packing my apartment, planning what came next. Through it all, graduation stayed fixed in my mind like a point of light. When things felt overwhelming, I told myself, just get through this, the payoff is coming. The week before the ceremony, Vanessa had one of her downturns, and that wasn't unusual. There was always something, a conflict, a disappointment, a feeling she couldn't quite name but insisted was unbearable. Normally I would have braced myself for what that meant, but this time I didn't. I told myself this was different. This time my parents would manage, both they had to, there was no reason they couldn't. That confidence carried me right up until the night before graduation. That was when my phone rang and my mom's name lit up the screen, and before I even answered, a familiar tension tightened in my chest. I knew the tone her voice would take before she spoke, low, controlled, urgent. "Honey, your sister's not doing well," she said. "She's overwhelmed, emotional, we might need to stay back tonight." The word might hung there, deceptively gentle. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my folded gown laid out neatly. "For the morning, stay back," I repeated quietly. "Not we'll figure it out, not we'll be there no matter what, just stay back." I told her it was one day, that it only happened once. There was a pause, then a sigh heavy with resignation. "You know how she is, Quinn, you're strong, you'll understand." That sentence landed like a verdict. You're strong wasn't comfort, it meant don't ask, don't push, don't make this harder. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice. I told myself it wasn't final. I told myself they'd still come. Vanessa always had moments like this, and somehow my parents always found a way to show up eventually. I clung to that logic because the alternative was too painful to consider. The morning of graduation arrived with a stillness that felt unnatural. I woke up early, stomach tight, thoughts racing, checked my phone, no messages, no reassurance. I showered, got dressed, adjusted my cap in the mirror, practicing a smile that felt too deliberate. I sent a text asking where they were, trying to sound casual, and the reply came quickly, "We can't make it, your sister needs us." No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what the day meant. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling slightly as something inside me went quiet. Standing in the stadium later, surrounded by noise and movement, I felt detached from my own body. Families waved across rows, shouted names, held up phones. I noticed things I hadn't expected to register: parents rehearsing cheers, siblings arguing over pictures, pride loud and messy and alive. My eyes kept drifting back to the same 3 seats, empty and unmistakable. When my name was called, I stood, heart pounding, legs steady despite everything, and walked toward the stage, lights blinding, applause loud. For a split second I felt suspended between who I had been and who I might become. I smiled because that's what you do when you've been trained to perform strength. I shook a hand, accepted a folder and turned back toward my seat. Somewhere in that short walk the last of my illusions fell away. It wasn't dramatic, there was no anger, no tears. It felt like a door closing quietly in a room I didn't realize I was standing in. When I sat down, the ceremony continued as if nothing had happened, and that was the most unsettling part. The world didn't pause to acknowledge the moment that broke something in me, it just kept going. After it ended, families flooded the field, hugging, laughing, taking photos that would live on walls for years. I stood at the edge watching, phone in hand, wondering if I should text again, ask why, give them another chance to explain. I already knew the answer. I took a few photos with friends, accepted congratulations, said the right words and left early. Back in my apartment, the quiet hit differently. I set my keys down, kicked off my shoes and stood there in my gown, the fabric suddenly heavy on my shoulders. I folded it carefully, smoothing the creases, treating it with more care than the day itself had received, and placed it in the back of my closet. I sat on the floor replaying the message, "Your sister needs us," until it lost meaning and became truth. That night I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't draft messages I'd never send. I sat with a realization that had been forming for years and finally finished taking shape. Love in my family wasn't unconditional, it was rationed, withdrawn the moment you stopped being convenient. And alongside the hurt, something else surfaced: resolve, quiet, steady resolve. Because if I stayed, if I kept accepting empty seats and postponed promises, I would keep teaching them that I didn't need to matter. And for the first time, that felt like a lesson I refused to repeat. I didn't wake up the next morning with panic or urgency, but with something heavier and steadier than either. The disappointment from graduation hadn't faded, it had settled into certainty. The kind that doesn't shout but doesn't move either. I moved through my apartment slowly, the way you do when you're careful not to disturb a thought that finally feels clear. Sunlight slipped through the blinds and landed on the stack of notebooks on my desk, on the framed photos I never rearranged because they were meant to represent continuity. I stood there, coffee cooling in my hand, realizing how much of my life had been built around anticipation instead of agency. For years I had been waiting for permission to matter, waiting for the moment my parents would look at me without comparison and say, "You are enough on your own." Graduation stripped that illusion bare. They hadn't failed to show up because of confusion or timing, they hadn't even pretended to try. They made a choice that aligned perfectly with every choice before it, and I finally stopped arguing with evidence. The suitcase in my closet wasn't symbolic, it was practical. I pulled it out and set it on the floor without ceremony, the zipper rasping as I opened it. I packed slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to feel each decision land. Sweaters, jeans, work clothes, my laptop, notebooks filled with late-night thoughts and plans. I didn't pack everything, I packed what mattered. As I moved through the apartment, memories surfaced neutrally. This was where I studied until dawn, this was where I waited for calls that didn't come, this was where I told myself next time would be different. I paused at a framed photo I hadn't looked at in years, me and my grandfather on a porch, his arm resting lightly on my shoulder. No performance, no expectation, just presence. I slipped it into my bag. The decision wasn't about punishment or escape, it was about self-preservation. Staying had become a slow erosion, and leaving felt like oxygen after holding my breath too long. I didn't announce what I was doing, I didn't send messages or ask for explanations, because I knew opening that door would turn this into a negotiation, and I was done negotiating my worth. I locked the apartment behind me and drove west with the radio off the road, stretching steady and indifferent. Mile by mile, the tightness in my chest loosened into something colder and clearer. I wasn't running toward something new, I was stepping away from something that had already shown me its limits. When I reached Grand Rapids, my grandfather opened the door before I knocked, as if he'd been waiting without knowing he was. He didn't ask why I was there, he didn't demand explanations, he set a mug of coffee in front of me and let silence do the work. That silence was different from the one I left behind, it wasn't empty, it was spacious. Over the next few days, the quiet from my parents was loud, no calls asking where I was, no concern masked as curiosity. The absence confirmed what I already knew. Then the messages started, not about me, but about money, a bill that didn't go through, a payment overdue, the tone shifting from casual to unsettled. That's when my grandfather told me something I hadn't known how to ask. He'd been helping my parents for years, quietly covering payments, smoothing gaps, keeping things stable when finances came up short. He said it matter-of-factly, not as accusation but context. Hearing it felt like a fracture snapping cleanly into place. The stability I grew up with hadn't been earned, it had been borrowed. And suddenly the way they treated me made sense. It's easier to ignore the child you believe will survive. My phone buzzed again, another message asking if I'd seen an account or moved anything by mistake. I typed nothing and set the phone face down on the table. That night my grandfather and I sat on the porch as the sky dimmed, the air cooling around us. He told me he was stepping back, done fixing what he didn't break, they'll have to stand on their own, he said quietly. For the first time I realized my leaving wasn't just an escape, it was a shift, a support removed, a weight lifted. Somewhere between the sound of crickets and the deepening dark, I understood this wasn't just about distance anymore, it was about consequences finally catching up. I went to bed knowing fallout would come, knowing calm wouldn't last, but for the first time I didn't feel responsible for cushioning it. The next morning the messages escalated, careful, polite at first. Hey, did you change anything? Something didn't go through, just checking. I didn't respond. 2 days later my mom called 3 times in one afternoon, her voicemail tight and rushed. We're just confused. Some bills are overdue. Your father thought maybe you saw something. You're good with details. Even now I was being cast as the fixer. That night my grandfather told me he'd informed them directly. He was stepping back, no more covering payments, no more fixing messes. They're going to panic, I said, and he nodded. They already are. The panic accelerated faster than I expected. By the end of the week my dad showed up at the house without warning, hands in pockets, jaw tight, looking smaller, less certain. We stayed on the porch, the door open behind me. Things are falling apart, he said. We're behind on everything. I waited, resisting the instinct to rescue. Your sister's having a hard time, he added. We didn't mean to hurt you. Explanation without accountability. You didn't miss a meeting, I said quietly. You missed my graduation. His face hardened. That again? We said we'd celebrate later. You always say later. You're being dramatic. Families make sacrifices. For who? I asked, and he didn't answer. He left. Frustrated, the conversation unresolved. That evening Vanessa confronted me where she knew I couldn't avoid, her voice loud, expression arranged. Mom's a wreck, Dad doesn't sleep, this is because of you. I moved out because you abandoned me. You knew how fragile things were, she snapped. Fragile, the word always used to protect her, never me. You skipped my graduation, that was your choice. I needed them, she said. I was falling apart. And I wasn't, I asked. You're always fine, she laughed. Something settled into place. That's the lie you've been living off. You're selfish, she accused. You couldn't wait, you had to make this about you. I stepped closer, lowered my voice. I made it about reality. I'm done paying for your comfort. She froze, stunned, not because I was cruel but because I wasn't bending. If this family falls apart because one person stopped carrying it, then it was never strong to begin with. She had no script. I walked away, heart pounding, not with fear but release. Over the next days the messages multiplied, pleading, accusation, confusion, entitlement, all confirming the same truth. They weren't asking how I was, they were scrambling to restore the system that kept them comfortable. I stayed silent because silence had become a boundary. And as pressure built on their end, I felt steadier, understanding this wasn't cruelty, it was consequence. The final confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors the way I once imagined moments like this would. It arrived politely disguised as reasonableness. My parents called and asked if I would come back to Detroit for a family meeting, the words chosen carefully, as if tone alone could make everything appropriate again. I agreed, not because I felt obligated, but because I was done carrying conversations in my head. I wanted the truth, spoken out loud, not filtered through voicemails and accusations. My grandfather insisted on coming with me, not to intervene, not to rescue, but to witness, and that distinction mattered more than anything. When we walked into the house, everything looked exactly the same, framed photos, aligned furniture placed, just so the illusion of order intact, and for a brief moment I understood how easy it would have been to keep pretending. My mom started crying before anyone sat down, the kind of crying that filled the room and demanded attention. We don't understand why you're doing this, she said, after everything we've done for you. I waited, letting the silence stretch, because rushing to speak only made room for denial to grow. You didn't come to my graduation, I said calmly. You didn't even apologize. My dad leaned forward, frustration bubbling. We were dealing with a crisis. Vanessa wasn't okay. A tantrum, I corrected, and the word landed hard. Vanessa scoffed. You're exaggerating, you always do this. My grandfather spoke then for the first time, his voice even steady. No, she's finally telling the truth. All 3 of them turned startled. I've been covering your payments for years, quietly, he continued. I believed I was helping both of my granddaughters. What I see now is that I was enabling favoritism. My mom's face drained. Dad, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, he said. You took her strength for granted and used it as an excuse to neglect her. My dad stood up, anger flaring. So what, you're cutting us off, letting everything collapse? My grandfather didn't raise his voice. I'm letting you face the consequences of your choices. The room erupted, accusations, defensiveness, Vanessa crying loudly, demanding to know how she was supposed to cope now, my mom insisting this was being blown out of proportion, my dad pacing, muttering about loyalty and family. I waited until the noise burned itself out. I'm not here to negotiate, I said. I'm here to be clear. They finally looked at me, really looked like they were seeing a version of me they hadn't Plan for I didn't leave to punish you. I continued. I left because staying was destroying me. I won't move back. I won't fix things for you, and I won't be guilt into carrying what was never mine to hold. My mom whispered my name. So you're choosing this over your family? I met her gaze. I'm choosing myself for the first time. The silence that followed felt final, not dramatic, just complete. When we walked out, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt light, like I had been holding my breath for years, and finally exhaled. Behind us, the perfect picture cracked, and for once I didn't turn around to save it. The fallout didn't explode, it eroded. Messages shifted from urgency to exhaustion. Bills stacked, plans quietly cancelled, neighbors stopped waving. Vanessa's crises no longer drew a crowd without someone smoothing things over. They lost their power. I stayed in Grand Rapids. Life became smaller, steadier. Mornings with coffee and quiet evenings with notes spread across the table, my grandfather reading nearby. I returned to my work with focus I'd never had before, because for the first time I wasn't trying to prove I deserved a seat at anyone's table. I already had one. My parents tried reaching through intermediaries, relatives, friends, vague concern disguised as curiosity. Is everything okay? Was there a misunderstanding? I recognized the pattern immediately. This was how systems protect themselves, by outsourcing pressure, hoping the quiet one will fold first. I didn't respond. Silence, I'd learned, can be a boundary, not weakness. Weeks passed, then months. The urgency around me faded completely. My parents stopped calling. Vanessa stopped showing up where confrontation might force a reaction. One afternoon, my mom sent a single message, not an apology, just a question about whether I'd come by sometime. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but clarity. Nostalgia only works when it's mutual. My grandfather never said I told you, so he didn't need to. He watched me breathe easier, laugh without scanning the room, sleep through the night. He told me once that families reveal themselves most clearly when resources are removed, and that love that only exists under comfort isn't love at all. The justice wasn't loud. There were no dramatic reckonings, just reality asserting itself. Once the distortion was gone, my parents learned what it meant to live within limits. Vanessa learned what it meant to sit with discomfort without an audience rushing to save her. And I learned something that changed how I moved through the world. Self-respect isn't betrayal. Silence isn't weakness. Walking away doesn't make you cruel. Sometimes it's the only way to stop teaching people they can build their lives on your disappearance. The family I thought I was losing had never really been mine to begin with, and the life I built afterward finally belonged to me. What surprised me most wasn't the anger or the silence, but how quickly the world reorganized itself once I stopped participating in the version of reality my family needed me to uphold. At first there was a strange lull, like the air after a storm where nothing moves, but everything has shifted. Days passed without messages, then weeks, and in that absence I began to notice how much of my mental space had been occupied by anticipation, by waiting for the next call, the next crisis, the next demand. Disguised as concern. Without that constant vigilance, my thoughts slowed, my body relaxed, my sleep deepened in ways I hadn't experienced since childhood. I woke up without bracing myself for someone else's emotions, without rehearsing explanations I would never give. The quiet felt earned, not empty. People around me noticed the change before I did. Friends commented that I seemed calmer, more present, less apologetic. I realized how often I used to preemptively soften myself to avoid conflict, how much energy I spent making sure I wasn't asking for too much, even when what I wanted was reasonable. That habit didn't disappear overnight, but it loosened its grip each day I spent choosing my own rhythm. My parents attempted one final narrative adjustment. When direct pressure failed, they framed my departure as a phase. They told relatives I was overwhelmed, that college had changed me, that I needed space. I heard about it through passing comments and second-hand concern, and for the first time it didn't sting, because the story no longer defined me. I wasn't obligated to correct it or defend myself, because I had stepped out of the role it required. When my dad eventually called again, his voice sounded tired in a way I'd never heard before. Stripped of certainty and authority, he asked if we could start over, find a way back to normal. Normal, I understood, meant me absorbing imbalance quietly while everyone else stayed comfortable. I told him I was open to respectful contact in the future, but only without expectation, pressure, or guilt. He was silent for a long time before admitting he didn't know how to do that. I told him that was something he would have to learn. After that, the calls stopped. Vanessa tried a different approach. She sent messages that alternated between nostalgia and accusation, memories reframed as proof of closeness, then complaints about how unfair everything was, how abandoned she felt, how hard it was without support. Reading them, I felt something I didn't expect. Indifference, not cruelty, just distance. Her words no longer had the power to rearrange my life, because I had stopped confusing empathy with obligation. In Grand Rapids, my life continued to settle into a steadiness that felt unfamiliar, then essential. I returned fully to my work, my focus sharper, because it wasn't constantly being pulled elsewhere. I made plans that didn't require contingency clauses for family emergencies that weren't mine to manage. Evenings became something I looked forward to, instead of something I endured waiting for interruption. My grandfather watched all of this quietly, never pushing forgiveness, never encouraging reconciliation. He understood something my parents never had: that reconciliation without change is just surrender with better language. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the light fade, he told me that when systems collapse, people often blame the absence rather than the imbalance. They say things fell apart because someone left, not because things were broken long before. Hearing that put words to something I had been feeling without articulating. I wasn't the cause of their instability, I was the mask hiding it. Removing the mask didn't create the problem, it revealed it. Extended family eventually stopped reaching out. Curiosity ran out when there was nothing dramatic to report. No tearful reconciliation, no explosive feud, just distance and quiet boundaries that didn't bend. Without someone smoothing over tension, the truth surfaced on its own. People began to notice patterns they had ignored before: the constant crises, the one-sided sacrifices, the way everything always seemed to land on the same person. I didn't need to explain it, the absence did the work for me. Months later, I ran into an old family friend at a grocery store. She looked uncomfortable, hesitant, before finally saying, "I never realized how much you carried until you stopped and everything started wobbling." I thanked her and left it at that, because recognition didn't need to turn into conversation. The biggest shift happened internally. I stopped measuring my worth by how little trouble I caused. I stopped equating strength with silence. I began asking for what I needed without rehearsing apologies in advance. It wasn't dramatic, it was incremental, but it changed how I moved through the world, how I chose relationships, how I set boundaries early instead of retroactively. I learned that being easy is not the same as being loved, and being strong does not mean being expendable. The peace I found wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or comfort. My parents didn't become villains in my mind, they became people limited by their choices, and those limitations no longer dictated my life. Vanessa didn't transform or apologize, she continued as she always had, but without my participation her behavior lost its leverage. I no longer felt responsible for outcomes that weren't mine to control. The absence of constant crisis created space for joy to arrive quietly, mornings that didn't rush, evenings that felt complete, laughter that didn't scan the room for reactions. One night my grandfather said something simple that stayed with me: "You didn't break this family, you stopped holding it together alone." That sentence reframed everything. The guilt I'd been carrying evaporated because it had been built on a lie. The lie that love requires self-erasure, that belonging must be earned through endurance. Walking away hadn't made me heartless, it had made me whole. And in that wholeness I finally understood what peace actually feels like: not relief after chaos, not calm borrowed from compliance, but stability rooted in self-respect. The future no longer felt like something I had to brace for, it felt open, and that openness was something I had earned by choosing myself when it mattered most. The longer I stayed away, the clearer it became that distance wasn't erasing my past, it was finally giving it definition. Memories resurfaced not as accusations but as data points, moments I had dismissed as normal now revealed patterns of control, subtle conditioning, quiet emotional accounting. I began to see how early I learned to scan rooms for moods, to anticipate needs, to stay useful rather than visible. How praise was conditional and affection transactional, how approval arrived only after sacrifice. This awareness didn't arrive all at once, it unfolded slowly through ordinary moments, like hesitating before buying something for myself or feeling a reflexive urge to justify rest. Each time I caught the impulse I traced it back and asked who taught me this and why. The answer was rarely malicious, but it was always consistent: a system where worth was measured by output, not presence. Understanding that allowed me to separate intention from impact without minimizing harm. I didn't need to label my parents monsters to acknowledge that their way of loving had been unsafe for me. That realization freed me from the exhausting task of defending them internally while trying to heal. I stopped rewriting memories to make them softer, stopped inserting excuses into moments that had already cost me enough. With that clarity came grief, not the loud, dramatic kind, but a quiet, steady mourning for the version of myself that had tried so hard to be small enough to fit expectations that were never meant to include her fully. I grieved the years spent believing endurance was a virtue and invisibility was maturity. That grief didn't paralyze me, it grounded me because it honored what I survived without romanticizing it. Therapy helped not because it gave me answers but because it gave me language for boundaries I had already started building. I learned that boundaries are not ultimatums, they are statements of capacity and choice. They don't punish, they clarify, and clarity felt Revolutionary after a lifetime of emotional fog. Relationships shifted as a result. Friendships that had thrived on my availability weakened when I stopped overfunctioning. Others deepened when I showed up honestly instead of helpfully. I learned to tolerate the discomfort of not being immediately needed without rushing to fill the silence. That discomfort passed, and what remained was discernment. I began choosing connections based on mutual effort rather than familiarity. The absence of family drama created room for curiosity. I tried things without needing them to prove anything. Hobbies that existed purely for enjoyment. Routines that weren't optimized for productivity. My nervous system recalibrated slowly. Nights became easier, mornings less heavy. I stopped waking with the sense that I was already behind before the day began. Occasionally guilt resurfaced, uninvited, especially during holidays or milestones when cultural scripts insisted reconciliation was the only acceptable ending. I let the guilt exist without obeying it, reminding myself that guilt is often just old training flaring up when you break pattern. I didn't need to resolve it, I just needed to not let it drive. When my parents' names came up in conversation, I no longer felt the urge to defend or explain. I simply stated we're not in contact right now and let the silence land. People reacted differently. Some nodded with understanding, others shifted uncomfortably as if my boundary challenged something in their own lives. I learned not to manage those reactions either. The truth doesn't need cushioning to be valid. Time passed and the urgency faded. The story stopped feeling like something I had to tell and became something I carried quietly without weight. I noticed how much lighter decisions felt when they weren't filtered through imagined reactions from people no longer present. I moved through the world more directly, less second-guessing, less bracing. The absence of constant self-monitoring created a confidence that wasn't performative, it was functional. I trusted myself to handle discomfort, to survive disapproval, to choose differently without collapsing. One day I realized I hadn't thought about my parents for an entire week, not out of avoidance, but because my life had grown larger than their absence. That realization startled me, then settled like proof of progress. Healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about integration, about allowing the past to inform without dictating. My grandfather remained a quiet anchor, never asking me to repair what others had broken, never urging me to soften my stance for appearances. He understood that peace is not the same as proximity, and that family is defined by behavior, not biology. His presence reminded me that healthy connection exists and doesn't require self-abandonment. Eventually letters arrived, handwritten, tentative apologies that acknowledged pain without fully owning it. I read them without urgency and responded with honesty without reopening doors I wasn't ready to walk through. I learned that closure is not an event but a practice, a series of choices that honor where you are rather than where others wish you'd return to. The most unexpected change was how I spoke to myself. The inner voice that once mirrored external criticism softened, replacing accusation with curiosity. When mistakes happened, I corrected instead of punished. When fear surfaced, I listened instead of suppressed. This internal shift mattered more than any external reconciliation because it meant the cycle ended with me. I was no longer rehearsing the past, I was building something new, informed by it but not confined to it. The question stopped being how do I fix this and became how do I want to live. That question guided decisions big and small, and its answer evolved as I did. I understood finally that walking away wasn't abandonment, it was alignment with a truth I had ignored for too long. The strength wasn't in endurance, it was in discernment. And that discernment gave me a life that felt like my own, not because it was perfect but because it was chosen. Power doesn't announce itself when it arrives, it reveals itself in hindsight through moments that once would have broken you but now simply register and pass. I noticed it first in how I handled conflict, not with silence or over-explanation but with brevity. When someone crossed a line, I didn't feel the need to educate them on why it hurt. I stated the boundary and watched what followed. Behavior became the metric, not words. This recalibration changed everything, especially how I evaluated apologies. I no longer listened for tone or emotion, I listened for accountability and change. Anything else was just noise. This clarity exposed how often I had accepted substitutes for respect in the past, how I had mistaken intensity for sincerity and familiarity for safety. Recognizing that pattern allowed me to interrupt it in real time. I stopped chasing closure from people who benefited from confusion. Instead, I focused on building consistency within myself. Routine stabilized not as discipline but as care, meals eaten without distraction, sleep protected without apology, time reserved for thinking, not fixing. These small acts compounded into trust in my own judgment, trust in my ability to choose environments that didn't require armor. The absence of constant tension sharpened my perception. I could feel when something was off earlier and respond before resentment accumulated. This wasn't hypervigilance, it was attunement developed from finally feeling safe enough to Notice, I learned that safety isn't passive, it's something you cultivate by removing chronic threats, even when those threats come disguised as family obligation. Moments of loneliness surfaced unexpectedly, not because I missed them but because I missed the idea of being witnessed by people who had known me longest. I let that loneliness exist without trying to solve it. I didn't rush to replace it with distraction or new attachments. Over time it transformed into solitude, a quieter, more spacious state where I could hear myself think. Creativity returned not as performance but as play. I wrote without audience, moved without purpose, laughed without checking who noticed. My nervous system responded by loosening its grip on urgency. I stopped measuring days by output and started noticing texture, light through windows, conversations that lingered, the satisfaction of finishing something simply because I chose to. Occasionally updates reached me through mutual acquaintances, news delivered casually as if it were neutral. My parents struggling socially, financially, emotionally, the fallout of years built on appearances finally landing. I listened without glee or guilt, acknowledging the information without internalizing responsibility. Compassion didn't require proximity and empathy didn't obligate intervention. I could wish them well without sacrificing myself to prove it. That distinction mattered. It was the line between old reflex and new integrity. I noticed how often people conflate forgiveness with access, how they assume letting go requires reopening doors. I didn't argue that assumption, I simply lived differently, letting my actions speak where explanations would only invite debate. The urge to justify my choices diminished as my confidence grew, not because I became hardened but because I became anchored. The more aligned my life felt, the less I needed validation from those who couldn't offer it honestly. Milestones arrived, promotions, relocations, relationships that felt reciprocal. I celebrated them quietly with people who had earned proximity through consistency, not history. Joy became something I allowed myself to experience without waiting for permission or fearing reprisal. Even setbacks felt different. They no longer triggered spirals of self-blame but activated problem-solving grounded in self-respect. I trusted that mistakes were survivable, that discomfort wasn't catastrophic, that disappointment didn't mean abandonment. This trust was earned through repetition, through choosing myself and surviving the consequences over and over again. The story of my life stopped revolving around what I had endured and started focusing on what I was building. I didn't erase the past, I integrated it as context, not identity. When I thought of my parents now, it was with neutrality tinged with sadness for what never was rather than anger for what had been. Anger had served its purpose. It had protected me long enough to establish boundaries, but it no longer needed to lead. I understood finally that healing isn't about reaching a state where nothing hurts, it's about expanding capacity so pain doesn't control direction. I became less reactive, more intentional, less concerned with fairness and more committed to truth. Truth as lived alignment, not moral superiority. The world responded accordingly. Opportunities aligned with values, relationships mirrored effort, environments reflected respect. Not perfectly but consistently enough to feel real. The biggest shift was internal authority. I stopped outsourcing my worth to consensus, stopped asking rooms for permission to exist fully. I learned that being misunderstood is survivable but self-betrayal isn't. This realization reframed every decision, especially those involving family narratives, societal expectations, and cultural scripts that prioritize unity over well-being. I didn't reject those scripts aggressively. I simply opted out quietly, letting my life become evidence of an alternative. One where peace wasn't purchased through silence and love wasn't conditional on compliance. Over time, even the question of reconciliation lost urgency, not because it was impossible but because it was no longer central. My life didn't hinge on their acknowledgement, my freedom didn't require their apology. That independence was the true inheritance my grandfather left me, the permission to choose integrity over illusion. As years passed, I noticed younger versions of myself in others, people over explaining, accommodating, shrinking to maintain peace. I offered presence, not advice, knowing that readiness can't be forced but witnessing can plant seeds. I didn't need to be loud about my journey to make it meaningful. I embodied it quietly, trusting that authenticity resonates without broadcast. Looking back, I understood that the dinner meant to erase me had instead clarified everything. It exposed dynamics that thrived in silence and collapsed under scrutiny. It forced a reckoning I had postponed out of loyalty that had never been mutual. While the night itself was brutal, its aftermath was liberating. It stripped away illusions faster than years of slow realization ever could. Sometimes rupture accelerates truth and truth accelerates growth. I didn't choose the betrayal but I chose the response, and that choice shaped everything that followed. The life I live now isn't defined by revenge or closure, it's defined by alignment, by waking each day without bracing for impact, by moving forward without dragging old debts behind me. The bill they handed me was never about money, it was about control, and once I refused to pay in pieces of myself, the debt disappeared. What remained was agency, and with it the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I belonged to myself first. Time has a way of testing decisions long after the adrenaline fades and the noise dies down, and it was time that confirmed I had chosen correctly. Not because life became easy, but because it became honest. Challenges still arrived, but they no longer carried the added weight of betrayal or self-doubt. I faced them with a steadiness that surprised even me, the kind that comes from knowing you are no longer negotiating your dignity. I noticed how my body responded differently to stress. My shoulders no longer lived permanently tensed, my jaw unclenched, my sleep deepened. These weren't small changes, they were evidence that I was no longer living in survival mode. Distance from my family had allowed my nervous system to stand down after decades on high alert. I could finally distinguish between urgency and importance, between real danger and emotional conditioning. This awareness sharpened my instincts in every area of life, especially work. I trusted my assessments, my conclusions, my ability to read situations without second-guessing myself into paralysis. Leadership opportunities found me not because I chased authority, but because clarity attracts responsibility. I spoke less, but when I did, people listened. Not because my voice was louder, but because it was anchored. The need to prove myself evaporated, and in its place grew competence that didn't require validation. This shift felt radical after a lifetime of earning space through usefulness. Now space was something I occupied without permission. Occasionally guilt attempted to resurface, usually dressed up as concern or nostalgia. But I recognized it for what it was, a reflex triggered by old narratives that equated separation with cruelty. I reminded myself that cruelty is intentional harm and boundaries are intentional care. The two are not the same. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my head, stopped imagining hypothetical confrontations, stopped preparing defenses for choices I no longer needed to justify. Silence became a form of peace rather than avoidance. When people asked about reconciliation, I answered honestly without defensiveness, maybe someday, but not today, and let that be enough. I learned that maturity isn't forcing resolution, it's tolerating ambiguity without collapsing into people-pleasing. The absence of family gatherings created space for new traditions, rituals built on presence rather than performance. Holidays became quieter, more intentional. I chose environments that felt safe rather than impressive, meals that nourished rather than displayed, conversations that flowed rather than interrogated. Joy stopped feeling like something that could be revoked at any moment. It became steady, understated, reliable. My sense of self expanded beyond reaction, beyond resistance, beyond survival. I wasn't living in opposition to my past anymore, I was living forward. Occasionally updates about my parents reached me, filtered through distance and time, consequences unfolding predictably as systems built on manipulation often do. Dwindling social circles, financial strain, reputational erosion. I felt no satisfaction in this, only a quiet acknowledgement that patterns eventually reveal themselves. I didn't need to witness the fallout directly to know it was happening. The urge to intervene didn't arise because I understood that rescuing them would only reset the cycle. Accountability loses meaning when consequences are outsourced. I honored my compassion by not weaponizing it against myself. The land behind the church became a symbol not of revenge but of reclamation. Watching it transform into something useful, something restorative, affirmed that endings can produce beginnings without spectacle. I visited the site once, standing quietly at the edge, observing progress without ceremony. It wasn't about closure, it was about continuity, about ensuring that what had been used as leverage for harm now served healing. I didn't need applause or acknowledgement, the work spoke for itself. People began to seek me out for advice, not because I had all the answers, but because I listened without agenda. I understood what it meant to be trusted without being used. The difference was subtle but unmistakable. Trust felt reciprocal, not extractive. I no longer confused proximity with intimacy or obligation with love. Relationships thrived or dissolved based on alignment rather than endurance. This discernment extended inward as well. I stopped forcing myself to pursue goals that looked impressive but felt hollow. I recalibrated success around sustainability, around values that could be maintained without self-sacrifice. Ambition softened into direction, purposeful but not punishing. I allowed myself to evolve without narrating every step, without proving growth to an audience that no longer existed. The quietness of my life would have once terrified me, now it felt like stability. I realized how much chaos I had normalized, how drama had masqueraded as connection, how intensity had replaced intimacy. Removing myself from that environment revealed how exhausting it had been just to exist within it. Peace wasn't boring, it was restorative. One day I noticed that my inner dialogue had changed tone entirely. Where once there had been criticism, there was now curiosity. Where once there had been urgency, there was now patience. This internal shift mattered more than any external victory because it meant the cycle truly ended with me. I wasn't replicating the dynamics. I had escaped. I was building something different, something quieter, something real. Legacy stopped being about lineage and became about impact, about the environments I created, the people I supported, the integrity I modeled. I understood that family isn't a hierarchy, it's a practice, and anyone unwilling to practice care consistently forfeits access regardless of title. This clarity freed me from resentment because resentment requires expectation, and I no longer expected them to become something they had never chosen to be. Acceptance didn't mean approval, it meant accuracy. I saw them clearly, without distortion, without hope, without denial. That clarity allowed me to grieve fully and move on completely. The story of my life stopped centering them, not because they disappeared, but because they no longer defined the narrative arc. I was no longer reacting, I was authoring. The future felt open, not in a vague, abstract way, but in a grounded, tangible sense, built on choices I trusted myself to make. I didn't need to prove resilience through suffering anymore. I proved it through consistency, through peace, through a life that didn't require explanation. If they ever looked back wondering where they went wrong, the answer wouldn't be found in my absence, but in their refusal to change when accountability was offered. I didn't carry that responsibility anymore. I carried only my own, and that weight felt manageable, even light. The bill they handed me had been an attempt to quantify my worth, to reduce a life to numbers and control. By walking away, I had refused the premise entirely. My worth was never theirs to calculate, and my freedom was never theirs to grant. That truth settled not as a declaration but as a fact, and facts don't need defending, they simply stand. What surprised me most as time moved forward was not how little I missed them, but how rarely they crossed my mind at all. Absence didn't ache the way I had been taught it would. It didn't hollow me out or leave unanswered questions circling endlessly. Instead, it created room. And in that room, my life grew roots that weren't tangled in obligation or fear. The idea that blood demanded loyalty lost its grip when I saw how loyalty without care becomes captivity. I had spent years confusing endurance with virtue, believing that staying quiet was kindness and self-erasure was maturity. Walking away corrected that lie in ways no conversation ever could. Distance didn't make me cruel, it made me accurate. I could see patterns clearly once I was no longer trapped inside them. I saw how control was disguised as concern, how criticism wore the costume of guidance, how love was rationed as leverage. Understanding this didn't ignite rage, it dissolved confusion. And confusion had been the real prison. Clarity simplified everything. Decisions stopped feeling heavy because they were no longer weighed down by imaginary obligations. I chose where to invest my energy with intention instead of habit. Work flourished not because I overextended but because I focused. I stopped compensating for other people's chaos and redirected that effort toward mastery. The results were undeniable. Promotions came with less resistance, collaborations felt balanced, negotiations felt clean. I didn't apologize for existing at the table anymore. I contributed and allowed that to be enough. Confidence settled in quietly like muscle memory, not loud, not performative, just steady. I noticed how people responded differently to me, not because I demanded respect, but because I expected it without hostility. There is a difference between guarding yourself and fortifying yourself, and I had finally learned it. My relationships reflected this shift. Friends became fewer but deeper, conversations longer but lighter. Because there was no subtext of proving or pleasing, disagreements didn't feel like threats, they felt like data. I could disagree without fear of abandonment because my sense of belonging no longer depended on compliance. This was perhaps the most radical change. Belonging had moved from external approval to internal alignment. I belonged to myself first, and that reordered everything else. The past stopped pulling at me, not because it disappeared, but because it no longer defined my trajectory. I stopped revisiting old scenes in my head, stopped rewriting outcomes, stopped fantasizing about acknowledgement or apology. Closure arrived not through validation but through detachment. I understood that waiting for remorse from people invested in denial only prolongs captivity. Letting go is not passive, it is an active decision to stop negotiating with the past. Occasionally news would surface, a brief update, a second-hand comment about financial strain or social fallout, and I would note it. Without emotional spike, it registered as information, not provocation. I had no urge to intervene, no instinct to fix. That reflex had finally been extinguished. Compassion remained, but it was no longer self-sacrificial. I could care without collapsing boundaries. That distinction had once seemed impossible, now it felt natural. The land project continued steadily and became a quiet anchor, a reminder that transformation does not require spectacle. Watching something neglected become functional Meaningful felt symbolic without being sentimental. I didn't attach my identity to it, but I respected what it represented. Restoration without reconciliation, progress without permission. The future unfolded with a rhythm I trusted. Setbacks still happened, but they were proportional, no longer catastrophic, because they weren't layered on top of emotional warfare. Stress existed, but it didn't metastasize into shame. I addressed problems directly without spiraling into self-blame. Resilience stopped being about toughness and became about recovery. How quickly I returned to baseline, how little damage lingered after impact. This was a new metric for strength, and it suited me better. I realized how much of my former resilience had been survival-oriented, how much energy had been spent bracing instead of building. Now I was building, slowly, deliberately, with materials chosen for longevity, not approval. Even my ambitions shifted from impressive to sustainable, from loud to effective. I wasn't interested in proving anything to anyone, especially not people who only valued me when I was useful. Usefulness is not love, and productivity is not belonging. That lesson settled deep and informed every choice I made thereafter. I no longer over-explained my decisions to people who hadn't earned context. Privacy became sacred, not as secrecy but as discernment. Not everyone deserves access to your reasoning, especially if they only intend to use it against you. I stopped mistaking transparency for honesty and learned that honesty sometimes means silence. The narrative others held about me ceased to matter because I was no longer living inside it. Stories lose power when you stop performing for their audience. My life no longer needed to be legible to people committed to misunderstanding it. I understood that some relationships are not meant to be healed but outgrown. Not every ending is a failure, some are corrections. I wasn't abandoning family, I was abandoning dysfunction. That distinction mattered. It reframed everything without romanticizing the cost. There was grief, yes, but it was clean grief, not complicated by guilt or hope. I mourned what never was rather than what was lost. That grief had an endpoint because it wasn't constantly reopened by fresh harm. Acceptance arrived not as resignation but as relief. I had stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopped scanning for emotional weather shifts, stopped preparing for conflict that never came. Peace proved itself through consistency. It didn't spike and crash, it held. Days stacked into weeks, into months, without incident, without rupture, without dread. This continuity was new and it was transformative. My nervous system learned what safety felt like and recalibrated accordingly. I was no longer hypervigilant, no longer bracing for impact. I could be present without guarding, rest without guilt, joy without suspicion. These were not small gains, they were foundational. I recognized how deeply scarcity had shaped my thinking: scarcity of affection, scarcity of approval, scarcity of safety. Stepping out of that environment shifted me into abundance, not materially but psychologically. I stopped hoarding emotional scraps, stopped settling for conditional connection, stopped accepting partial presence as full love. I expected consistency, and when it wasn't offered, I walked away without drama. Boundaries stopped being walls and became filters. What passed through them was healthier by design. This clarity extended into how I viewed the future. I no longer feared becoming like them because I understood the mechanisms that created them, and I was actively choosing differently. Cycles end when awareness meets action. I was no longer repeating patterns unconsciously, I was interrupting them deliberately. That knowledge brought peace that no external reconciliation could have provided. My life was no longer defined by what I endured but by what I cultivated, and that shift made everything else irrelevant. There came a point where I stopped framing my life as a response to what happened and started experiencing it as something autonomous, something that existed on its own terms rather than in opposition to a past that no longer had jurisdiction over me. This was subtle but profound because reaction still grants power to the thing you are reacting against. And freedom truly begins when your choices are no longer shaped by avoidance or defiance but by alignment. I wasn't trying to prove I was right or that they were wrong anymore. I was simply living in a way that made sense to me. The absence of their voices in my head was not sudden, it faded gradually like background noise you didn't realize you'd grown accustomed to until silence arrived. And in that silence I discovered preferences that had nothing to do with survival. I learned what I liked, not what was tolerated. I learned how I wanted to spend my time, not how to stay out of trouble. Even rest changed its meaning. Rest was no longer recovery from damage, it was preparation for growth. I didn't need to earn it through exhaustion or justify it through productivity. It became a neutral state, not a reward. That alone rewired how I approached ambition, because ambition untethered from fear becomes creativity. I pursued goals because they intrigued me, not because they promised validation. And when obstacles arose, I met them with curiosity instead of panic. The internal pressure to be exceptional evaporated, and in its place emerged a steady competence that didn't need witnesses. I stopped measuring success by visibility and started measuring it by stability. How predictable my peace was, how sustainable my routines felt, how little drama accompanied my days. There was a quiet pride in this kind of success, one that didn't announce itself but endured. Occasionally I would encounter reminders of the old dynamic in unexpected places, a tone of voice that mimicked condescension, a backhanded compliment disguised as concern, and instead of shrinking I would notice it objectively, like observing a familiar pattern from a distance. It no longer activated me because it no longer belonged to me. Those moments reinforced how far I had come, because the old reflex to placate, to explain, to soften was simply gone, replaced by a neutral disengagement that conserved energy. I learned that not every provocation requires a response, and that silence is often the most honest reply when someone is committed to misunderstanding you. My sense of self stopped fluctuating based on how I was perceived. Criticism didn't destabilize me and praise didn't inflate me, because both were external data points, not identity anchors. This emotional neutrality wasn't numbness, it was balance. I still felt deeply, but my feelings no longer hijacked my decisions. I trusted myself enough to let emotions pass without acting on them prematurely. This trust was earned through consistency, through showing up for myself in small ways daily rather than dramatic declarations. Integrity became internal alignment, not external morality. I did what I said I would do even when no one was watching, and that built a foundation of self-respect that no one could revoke. I realized how much of my former compliance had been driven by fear of loss, fear of being excluded, punished, abandoned. Once I accepted that some losses are necessary for growth, that fear lost its leverage. You cannot threaten someone with exclusion when they have already chosen solitude over erasure. Independence is not isolation, it is agency. I didn't need to be surrounded to feel secure, I needed to be intact. That distinction clarified every relationship moving forward. I was no longer auditioning for belonging, I was assessing compatibility. People entered my life slowly and intentionally, and when they did, they met someone who was clear about limits without being rigid. Generosity without obligation, warmth without submission. The quality of connection improved because it was no longer distorted by power imbalance. Reciprocity replaced endurance. I noticed how differently conflict played out in this new context. Disagreements were addressed directly without emotional escalation because there was no hidden threat of abandonment attached to them. Resolution became possible because safety existed underneath the tension. This was something I had never experienced before, and it recalibrated my expectations permanently. I no longer romanticized intensity or chaos, mistaking it for closeness. Calm became the baseline, and anything that disrupted it had to justify its presence. This didn't make life boring, it made it spacious. Joy had room to expand without being immediately eclipsed by crisis. Laughter felt lighter because it wasn't compensatory. Celebration didn't come with a shadow of impending punishment. Even nostalgia shifted its tone. Memories surfaced without dragging me backward. They felt like closed chapters rather than open wounds. I could acknowledge the good without denying the harm, and that integration felt like maturity rather than forgiveness. Forgiveness implies a moral transaction that still centers the offender, whereas acceptance centers reality. I accepted that they were who they were, and that I was not required to contort myself to accommodate that. This acceptance didn't absolve them, it released me. It allowed me to stop arguing with history and start investing in the present. I built rituals that grounded me, morning routines that oriented my day, evening habits that signaled safety to my nervous system. These rituals weren't rigid, they were supportive. They reminded me daily that my life belonged to me now, and that stability was something I could create internally regardless of external conditions. I became less reactive to uncertainty because my sense of safety was no longer outsourced. Financial independence reinforced this, but it wasn't the source of it. The real shift had occurred long before money entered the picture. It happened the moment I stopped seeking permission to exist fully. Money simply removed logistical barriers, it didn't create the courage that had already been claimed. I understood then that walking away had not been an act of defiance but an act of fidelity to myself, fidelity to my own well-being, my own future, my own sense of dignity. And that fidelity required maintenance, not vigilance. I didn't need to constantly remind myself why I left because the benefits spoke for themselves. Peace doesn't require justification, it validates itself through experience. Every calm morning, every uninterrupted night, every decision made without fear was evidence enough. I no longer fantasized about confrontations or imagined scenarios where I was finally understood. Understanding ceased to be a requirement for peace. Some people will never grasp the harm they caused because doing so would collapse the narrative they rely on to see themselves as good. I accepted that and moved on. Truth does not need universal agreement to remain true. I lived in accordance with what I knew, and that alignment replaced the need for external validation. My life became quieter but richer, simpler but deeper. Complexity shifted from emotional chaos to meaningful challenge. I invested in skills that sharpened me, relationships that nourished me, projects that stretched me in healthy ways. There was effort, yes, but it was chosen effort, not coerced sacrifice. I began to recognize my own voice more clearly in decisions, and that voice was calm, measured, and decisive, not frantic or apologetic. This internal leadership was new and empowering. I no longer waited for crises to justify change. I adjusted proactively. I trusted my instincts because they had proven reliable once freed from fear. The future stopped feeling like something to brace for and started feeling like something to shape. I didn't need to control it, I needed to participate in it with presence and intention. This shift altered how I experienced time. I was no longer racing ahead or clinging to the past, I was inhabiting the present fully. And in that presence I found contentment, not as complacency but as grounded satisfaction. Ambition remained, but it was integrated rather than compulsive. I wanted more, but not at the expense of myself. I had learned the cost of that bargain, and I refused to pay it again. The version of me that once believed love had to be earned through endurance felt distant, almost unrecognizable. But I honored her because she did the best she could with what she knew. She survived long enough for me to choose differently. And that choice was the real inheritance. Not money, not land, not approval, but agency. The ability to author my own life without apology. And that ability, once claimed, cannot be taken away. The final understanding did not arrive with fireworks or confrontation, it arrived quietly one ordinary morning when I realized I was no longer waiting for anything to happen. Not an apology, not an explanation, not a reversal, not even acknowledgement. The absence of anticipation was the signal that the story had ended on my terms. I had crossed the threshold from recovery into authorship, and that distinction mattered because recovery still looks backward while authorship looks forward. I was no longer managing damage, I was designing direction. The past had become context, not command. It informed me without instructing me. And that was the clearest sign that I had reclaimed power fully. Power does not announce itself, it stabilizes. It shows up as consistency in how you treat yourself when no one is watching, and restraint in how you engage when provoked. I no longer needed to narrate my decisions to justify them. I trusted my internal reasoning enough to act without audience approval. This self-trust was not arrogance, it was earned through repetition, through honoring my own boundaries, even when it was inconvenient, through choosing long-term peace over short-term relief. Every time I resisted the urge to explain or re-engage, I reinforced the truth that my life did not require their consent. Silence became not a tactic but a state of being. It was spacious and calm and free of rehearsal. I was not rehearsing future conversations in my head, or replaying old ones to extract new meaning. The mental loops that once consumed me had dissolved because there was nothing left to resolve. Resolution had already occurred internally. I had accepted that some people cannot meet you where you are because doing so would require them to leave who they pretend to be. That is not a failure of communication, it is a refusal of accountability. Understanding that freed me from the exhausting work of translation. I stopped trying to make myself legible to those committed to misreading me. My energy redirected naturally toward creation, toward experiences that expanded rather than contracted me. I invested in learning not as escape but as enrichment. Curiosity replaced hypervigilance and wonder replaced dread. Even challenges felt different because they were no longer layered with emotional threat. Setbacks were addressed pragmatically without spiraling into self-doubt. Success was received with gratitude rather than suspicion. I allowed good things to happen without immediately preparing for their removal. This was perhaps the most radical shift of all, allowing joy to exist without bracing for loss. Joy without armor is vulnerable, but it is also honest. I learned that guarding yourself against pain also guards you against connection, and I was no longer interested in living half protected and half absent. I accepted risk, selectively trusting discernment over fear. Boundaries guided me, not walls. I let people in slowly and watched how they handled care, how they responded to no, how they respected time and space. Patterns revealed themselves quickly once I stopped rationalizing red flags. Discernment became intuitive rather than analytical because my nervous system was no longer conditioned to normalize harm. Safety had recalibrated my instincts. This allowed me to recognize compatibility without intensity and trust without drama. The relationships that emerged were steady and mutual, not extractive or conditional. They didn't require me to perform strength or suppress discomfort to maintain harmony. Honesty was met with curiosity rather than punishment. Disagreement didn't threaten connection, it clarified it. This kind of relational stability felt almost surreal at first because it was so different from what I had known, but over time it became the standard. I stopped romanticizing struggle as depth and started valuing consistency as intimacy. My sense of identity continued to solidify not around what I had survived but around what I stood for. Values replaced reactions as my compass. I made choices based on alignment, not approval. This made my life quieter but far more intentional. Even solitude felt full because it was chosen, not imposed. I could be alone without feeling abandoned and connected without feeling consumed. Autonomy became the foundation of everything, not isolation but sovereignty. I belonged to myself, and that belonging made all other connections optional rather than necessary. This was the opposite of loneliness, it was freedom. The urge to revisit the past occasionally surfaced, not with longing but with reflection, and when it did I met it with compassion rather than critique. I acknowledged the version of myself who endured without shaming her for not leaving sooner. She had been doing the best she could with the information and resources she had. Survival precedes choice and awareness precedes change. I honored that progression rather than rushing to judge it. This self-compassion closed the final loop of healing. There was nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. I had integrated the experience into my narrative without allowing it to define my identity. I was not the person who was abandoned or overlooked or undervalued. I was the person who chose herself when it mattered most. That choice echoed forward, shaping everything that followed. It informed how I worked, how I loved, how I rested, how I planned for the future. The future no longer felt like a place I had to earn. Access to it felt like an open field shaped by intention and care. I made long-term plans without factoring in crisis management. Stability allowed for vision. I could imagine years ahead without dread, and that alone was transformative. Even when uncertainty appeared, it didn't destabilize me because my foundation was internal, not contingent. I trusted myself to adapt without losing myself. Adaptability replaced endurance as my measure of resilience. This shift changed how I viewed success. Success became sustainability rather than spectacle, peace rather than performance, fulfillment rather than validation. I didn't need witnesses to confirm my worth. I experienced it directly through lived consistency. My days reflected my values, my energy matched my priorities, and my boundaries protected both. This coherence felt deeply satisfying in a way approval never had. I understood then that the true cost of staying had not been time or effort but identity. It had preserved my sense of self. That preservation allowed me to build a life that felt honest rather than reactive. I didn't need to rewrite the past to justify the present because the present stood on its own merits. Peace did not need a narrative, it needed maintenance. And maintenance was simple honesty with myself daily. I asked what supported my well-being and what depleted it, and I acted accordingly without apology. Guilt no longer dictated my choices because guilt requires internalized obligation, and I had released that contract. Obligation without reciprocity is exploitation, and I refused to participate in it anymore. This clarity did not harden me, it refined me. I became more discerning, more grounded, more present. Kindness returned without self-sacrifice. Generosity returned without expectation. Love returned without fear. I did not become smaller by leaving, I became more whole. The life I built was not loud, but it was real. Not perfect, but it was aligned, and alignment proved to be the most powerful form of peace. I did not need closure from them because I had given it to myself through action. Walking away had not been an ending, it had been an initiation into a life that honored me fully. And as I stood in that life, grounded, calm, and intact, I knew without question that the decision I once made quietly without announcement had been the most decisive act of self-respect I would ever perform. I did not disappear